Miami's paradise is collapsing, and what's destroying this iconic city isn't what you think. Right now, while you're watching this, luxury towers are sinking into the ocean, entire neighborhoods are vanishing underwater, and the wealthiest people on Earth are quietly abandoning their $100 million penthouses. But here's what nobody's telling you. This isn't just about rising seas or climate change. This is about greed, corruption, and a secret that developers have been hiding for decades. And the worst part, you've probably felt this same betrayal in your own city without even realizing it. What happened to Miami is coming for all of us. And by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why paradise always has a price and who's really paying it. Once upon a time, Miami was more than just a city. It was a dream materialized in concrete and glass, a promise whispered across oceans to immigrants seeking fortune, to retirees chasing endless summer, to artists and entrepreneurs drawn to its electric energy. Picture this. The year is 1985. The beach stretches like a golden ribbon. The Art Deco buildings glow in pastel perfection, and the air smells of possibility mixed with salt and citrus. Families gather on pristine shores. Children build sandcastles while parents sip cocktails, believing they've found their slice of heaven. The city pulses with authentic culture. Cuban cafeterias serve coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and neighborhoods thrive with real communities where people actually know their neighbors' names. This was Miami before the towers, before the oligarchs, before the word luxury became a weapon used to displace everyone who couldn't afford to stay. But something changed. Slowly, at first, then all at once, the soul of Miami began to evaporate like morning dew under the merciless Florida sun. We've all seen this pattern, haven't we? That moment when your favorite local spot gets replaced by another generic chain. When rent doubles overnight. When the neighborhood you grew up in becomes unrecognizable, filled with glass condos and empty streets because nobody actually lives there anymore. Miami didn't just change. Miami was transformed, rebuilt, and ultimately betrayed by the very people who promised to make it better. And the mechanism of this betrayal is so elegant, so perfectly designed, that most people never see it coming until it's far too late. The transformation began in the late 1990s when developers discovered something remarkable. Miami's coast wasn't just valuable real estate. It was the perfect playground for global capital seeking a safe haven. Powerful oligarchs, South American billionaires, European aristocracy, they all needed somewhere to park their money, somewhere glamorous and relatively stable, somewhere that asked very few questions about where that money came from. And Miami, desperate for investment after economic struggles, opened its arms wide. But wait until you see what came next, because this is where the story gets darker than anyone imagined. These weren't just wealthy people buying homes. These were financial instruments disguised as luxury apartments. Entire buildings purchased by shell corporations, owned by entities registered in the Cayman Islands or Panama or Luxembourg. Properties that would sit empty 350 days a year, while their real owners treated them like safety deposit boxes in the sky. The developers didn't care. Why would they? They made their fortune on the sale, not on whether anyone actually lived there. And the city government didn't care either, because they collected property taxes regardless of occupancy, and those taxes were astronomical. Everyone was getting rich except the people who actually called Miami home. Think about this for a moment. Imagine you're a teacher, a nurse, a firefighter, someone who actually makes the city function. You've lived in Miami your entire life. Your parents lived here, maybe your grandparents too. Then one day, your landlord tells you your rent is doubling. Not because anything improved, but because some developer decided your neighborhood is the next hotspot. You can't afford it. Neither can your neighbors. Within 2 years, everyone you know has been pushed out, scattered across Florida or beyond, communities destroyed, families separated. And in your place, empty towers. Ghost buildings owned by people who'll never set foot in Miami, who bought these properties the way you might buy stocks, as abstract investments with no human cost attached. But there absolutely is a human cost, and somebody has to pay it. Now here's where it gets even worse, and trust me, you'll want to hear this part, because it reveals the fundamental lie at the heart of modern cities. The developers knew something that they never told the buyers. They knew the ground itself was unstable, that Miami Beach sits on porous limestone that's basically Swiss cheese, full of holes and channels through which seawater flows freely. They knew that the city was built on reclaimed swampland, that the water table is rising, that king tides already flood the streets multiple times a year. They knew that within 30 years, maybe less, huge portions of Miami would be underwater. Not theoretically, not possibly, definitely, scientifically, inevitably. And they sold billion-dollar properties anyway. Towers marketed as generational wealth, as family legacies, as investments that would appreciate forever. They lied. Not through words, but through omission. And the really sick part? They didn't care, because they had already made their money and moved on to the next city, the next coastline, the next group of victims. We've all experienced smaller versions of this betrayal, haven't we? That time you discovered the product you loved was actually harmful, but the company knew and sold it anyway. That moment you realized the politician you voted for was serving corporate interests instead of yours. That sick feeling when you understand that the people in charge view you not as a human being, but as a resource to be extracted, a problem to be managed or removed. Miami's collapse is that betrayal, writ large, painted in sunset colors and sold with champagne and promises. Let's talk about the architecture of this disaster, because it's almost beautiful in its cruelty. The luxury developments that sprang up along Miami Beach weren't designed for durability or community or sustainability. They were designed for maximum profit extraction in minimum time. Developers would buy land through complex financial arrangements involving foreign capital, then build as quickly and cheaply as possible while marketing the results as ultra-luxury. The materials? Often substandard. The construction oversight? Minimal. The concern for long-term stability? Non-existent. These buildings were never meant to last generations. They were meant to sell fast, sell high, and generate immediate returns before anyone noticed the cracks, the flooding, the foundation issues. And speaking of foundations, let's discuss what's literally happening beneath Miami right now. The limestone bedrock is porous, which means water seeps through constantly, rising with the tides, corroding the infrastructure from below. Engineers have known this for decades. They've written papers about it, given presentations, warned officials. But the money was too good, the development too lucrative, the political pressure too intense. So they kept building, kept approving projects, kept selling the dream while the nightmare grew beneath the surface. And now that nightmare is emerging. Buildings show stress fractures. Parking garages flood with seawater during high tide. Residents report strange sounds at night, creaking and groaning as structures settle and shift. One condo building, Champlain Tower South, actually collapsed in 2021, killing 98 people. The warning signs had been there for years. Inspectors had noted significant damage, but nothing was done until it was catastrophically too late. You know what's truly terrifying about the Champlain Tower's collapse? It wasn't an anomaly. It was a preview. Engineers estimate that dozens of buildings along Miami Beach face similar structural issues. The salt air corrodes rebar. The rising water table undermines foundations. The porous limestone provides no stable base. But here's the really insidious part. Property values haven't crashed. Despite the obvious danger, despite the flooding, despite the collapse, people are still buying, still investing, still pretending everything is fine. Why? Because the system is designed to keep the illusion going as long as possible. Real estate agents don't mention the flood risk. Developers don't highlight the sinking foundations. Banks keep approving mortgages. Insurance companies keep writing policies, albeit at increasingly astronomical rates. Everyone involved has an incentive to keep the game going for just one more sale, one more commission, one more transaction before the whole thing collapses. And the hurricanes are getting worse. Miami sits directly in the path of increasingly violent storms supercharged by warming ocean temperatures. Each hurricane season brings new destruction, new flooding, new reminders that this city is fundamentally vulnerable to forces it cannot control. But instead of preparing, instead of adapting, instead of making difficult decisions about managed retreat and sustainable development, Miami just keeps building. Higher towers, more luxury, greater density, all on land that scientists agree will be uninhabitable within decades. It's a collective delusion, a mass psychosis driven by greed and enabled by political corruption. Let's talk about that corruption because it's crucial to understanding how this happened. Miami-Dade County has a long history of political scandals, of officials taking bribes from developers, of regulations being weakened or ignored in exchange for campaign contributions. The development industry essentially captured the regulatory apparatus meant to protect residents. Zoning boards became rubber stamps for whatever developers wanted. Environmental reviews were rushed or superficial. Community input was ignored or dismissed. The people making decisions about Miami's future had direct financial interests in continuing the development boom, regardless of the long-term consequences. And when concerned citizens raised alarms, when scientists presented data, when activists demanded accountability, they were labeled as alarmists, as anti-business, as obstacles to progress. But here's the thing about progress. Real progress means building something sustainable, something that serves everyone, something that lasts. What happened in Miami wasn't progress. It was extraction disguised as development, greed masquerading as growth. And the people who profited most from this extraction are the ones who will suffer least from its consequences. The wealthy foreign investors who bought properties as financial instruments, they'll write off the losses. The developers who built shoddy towers, they're protected by corporate structures and moved on years ago. The politicians who enabled it all? They've retired on generous pensions or moved into lucrative private sector jobs. Who pays the price? The same people who always pay it. Working families who can't afford to move, elderly residents on fixed incomes, immigrant communities with nowhere else to go. And it's not just flooding and hurricanes. Miami faces a cascade of interconnected crises that feed into each other. The rising sea level causes saltwater intrusion into the aquifer, contaminating the drinking water supply. The increased flooding breeds disease and destroys infrastructure. The heat island effect, amplified by all that concrete and glass, makes summers increasingly unbearable. The traffic congestion, worsened by poor planning and inadequate public transit, strangles the city. The cost of living, inflated by speculation and foreign investment, pushes out everyone except the ultra-wealthy. And all of this creates a two-tiered city, the gleaming, air-conditioned fortress for the rich and the increasingly desperate reality for everyone else. You've seen this pattern before, haven't you? Maybe in a different context, maybe on a smaller scale, but you recognize the symptoms. The prioritization of profit over people, the short-term thinking that sacrifices the future for immediate gains, the lies told by people in positions of trust, the feeling of helplessness as forces beyond your control reshape your world without your consent. Miami's story is America's story, is capitalism's story, is humanity's story of what happens when we let greed become the organizing principle of society. And the saddest part is that it didn't have to be this way. Every single problem Miami faces was predictable, was predicted, and could have been prevented if anyone in power had cared more about the long-term well-being of the community than about short-term profits. But wait, there's another layer to this disaster that nobody talks about, and it might be the most important part of all. Miami's transformation didn't just destroy physical communities. It destroyed something more fundamental. The idea that a place can belong to the people who live there. That a city can have a soul beyond its economic value. That home means something more than a commodity to be bought and sold. Think about the cultural institutions that have vanished, the local businesses replaced by chain stores, the music venues and art galleries and neighborhood bars where real community formed, all swept away by rising rents and redevelopment. A city's true wealth isn't measured in property values or tax revenue. It's measured in connections, in memories, in the web of relationships that turn a collection of buildings into something alive. Miami didn't just lose buildings to the rising sea. It lost its soul to rising profits. The irony is almost too perfect. Developers marketed Miami as paradise, as the ultimate destination, as the place where dreams come true. They plastered images of perfect beaches and perfect bodies across every advertisement, promised luxury and exclusivity and the good life. And people bought it, literally and figuratively. But paradise was always a lie, a marketing construct designed to extract wealth from buyers and labor from workers while enriching a small group of developers and investors. Real paradise is a neighborhood where children play safely in the streets, where elderly people can afford to age with dignity, where immigrants find opportunity and community, where art and culture flourish not as commodities but as expressions of human creativity and joy. That kind of paradise existed in Miami once, in neighborhoods built by people who cared about more than profit. But it's been systematically destroyed, replaced by the false paradise of wealth accumulation. And now that false paradise is literally sinking into the ocean, and we're all supposed to act surprised? Scientists have been warning about sea level rise for decades. Engineers have documented the infrastructure problems. Residents have complained about the flooding and the traffic and the displacement. But the machine kept churning, kept building, kept promising that Miami would be different, that the rules of physics and economics wouldn't apply here, that growth could continue forever without consequences. That delusion is collapsing now, as surely as Champlain Towers collapsed, as surely as the seawalls are failing, as surely as the streets flood with increasing frequency. So where does this leave Miami? Where does it leave the 1.5 million people who still call it home? Where does it leave us, watching from afar but recognizing the pattern in our own cities? The honest answer is grim. Miami, as we know it, is probably doomed. Not immediately, not next year, but within our lifetimes, huge portions of the city will be uninhabitable. The question isn't whether Miami will survive. The question is what comes next and who gets to decide. Will it be a managed retreat, a planned relocation that prioritizes vulnerable communities? Or will it be chaos, a scramble where the wealthy buy their way to safety while everyone else is abandoned? Will we learn from this disaster and change how we build cities? Or will we just move on to the next coastline, repeating the same mistakes with the same predictable results? The real tragedy of Miami isn't the flooding or the corruption or even the displacement. The real tragedy is that all of it was avoidable. Every expert warned about the consequences of overdevelopment on vulnerable coastline. Every scientist presented data about rising seas and porous limestone. Every community organizer pointed out that displacing working families would destroy the social fabric that makes a city livable. But those warnings were ignored, dismissed as inconvenient obstacles to profit. And now here we are, watching paradise collapse in slow motion, a collapse that could have been prevented if anyone in power had valued people over profit. There's something you need to understand about disasters like this. They don't just happen. They're made. They're the result of thousands of individual decisions, each one justified by market logic and economic rationality, each one perfectly legal and above board, each one contributing to a cumulative disaster that no single person intended but everyone enabled. Miami's collapse is capitalism functioning exactly as intended, extracting maximum value until there's nothing left to extract, then moving on to the next target. You're probably wondering if there's any hope, any solution, any way to stop this pattern from repeating in your city. The answer is complicated. Technically, yes, absolutely. We have the engineering knowledge to build sustainable cities. We have the scientific understanding to adapt to climate change. We have the economic resources to relocate communities and preserve what matters. What we lack is the political will to prioritize long-term survival over short-term profit, to value human well-being over property values. And achieving that political will requires something that seems increasingly impossible: collective action by ordinary people to demand fundamental change in how cities are planned, built, and governed. But here's what gives me a sliver of hope. People are waking up. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably. Communities across America are starting to recognize the pattern, to see through the marketing and the lies, to understand that the crisis in Miami is coming for them too, unless something changes. Young people especially are refusing to accept the logic that destroyed previous generations, questioning why housing should be an investment commodity instead of a human right, why cities should be playgrounds for billionaires instead of homes for working families. This awakening is fragile and easily co-opted, but it's real, and it represents the possibility of building something different. Imagine for a moment what Miami could have been. Imagine if, instead of luxury towers for foreign investors, they had built affordable housing for the people who actually work there. Imagine if, instead of prioritizing development at all costs, they had invested in sustainable infrastructure and climate adaptation. Imagine if, instead of letting wealthy speculators drive up prices, they had implemented policies to preserve communities and protect long-term residents. That Miami could have survived. That Miami could have thrived. That Miami could have actually been the paradise it pretended to be. But that would have required viewing success differently, measuring prosperity in terms of human flourishing instead of property values. And our current system simply doesn't allow for that kind of thinking at the necessary scale. So Miami keeps flooding, keeps sinking, keeps collapsing. The luxury towers stand against the skyline like tombstones marking the death of a dream that was always a lie. The streets flood with increasing regularity, seawater mixing with sewage, creating a toxic soup that makes neighborhoods uninhabitable. The insurance companies quietly withdraw coverage. The banks stop approving mortgages. The wealthy prepare their exit strategies. And the people who can't afford to leave, who have nowhere else to go, who built lives and families and communities in Miami, they're left to face the consequences of decisions they never got to make, betrayed by a system that views them as expendable in the pursuit of profit. This is how empires fall, how civilizations collapse, how paradise turns to wasteland. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a slow accumulation of bad decisions driven by greed and short-sighted thinking. Miami is a warning, a preview of what happens when we let markets dictate the shape of our cities and our lives without regard for sustainability or justice or basic human decency. It's a lesson written in concrete and seawater, in displacement and corruption, in broken promises and shattered communities. And the question facing all of us is whether we'll heed that warning and demand something different, or whether we'll keep making the same mistakes until there's nothing left but empty towers sinking into the rising sea. The sun still sets over Miami in breathtaking displays of color. The beach still stretches along the coast, though narrower each year, claimed inch by the advancing ocean. The palm trees still sway in the tropical breeze, though increasingly battered by storms that grow more violent. From a distance, from the right angle, at the right time of day, it can still look like paradise. But look closer. Look at the water lines on building foundations. Look at the empty storefronts and displaced communities. Look at who's buying and who's selling and who's being forced out. Look at the future that scientists predict with increasing confidence and decreasing hope. And then ask yourself, is this the world we want to build? Miami's collapse isn't just about one city in Florida. It's about what happens when we build our entire civilization on the shaky foundation of endless growth, when we treat everything and everyone as commodities to be bought and sold, when we sacrifice the future for the immediate satisfaction of profit. It's about the cost of greed, the price of corruption, the consequences of prioritizing wealth accumulation over human well-being. And it's about all of us, because we're all complicit in systems that produce these outcomes, all caught in economic structures that value property over people. Empty tables line the boardwalk, restaurants closed because nobody lives in the luxury towers above them. Empty streets stretch through once vibrant neighborhoods, communities scattered to the winds of displacement. Empty dreams haunt the people who believed in the promise of paradise, who worked hard and played by the rules only to discover that the game was rigged from the start. Empty towers stand as monuments to greed, to corruption, to the fundamental lie at the heart of modern capitalism, that infinite growth is possible, that consequences can be deferred forever, that someone else will always pay the price for our excess. Maybe there's still hope. Maybe Miami can be saved, or at least transformed into something more honest, more sustainable, more humane. Maybe the people who remain will organize and demand accountability, will force politicians to prioritize residents over developers, will build new systems based on cooperation instead of exploitation. Maybe this disaster will finally force us to confront the unsustainable nature of how we build cities, how we value land, how we think about growth and prosperity. Or maybe not. Maybe Miami is just the first domino to fall. The warning we'll ignore until it's too late. Maybe we'll keep building towers on sinking ground, keep displacing communities for profit, keep prioritizing short-term gain over long-term survival. Maybe future generations will look back at Miami wondering how people could be so blind, so greedy, so willfully ignorant of the disaster they were creating. The water keeps rising. The towers keep sinking. The people keep leaving. And somewhere, right now, a developer is planning the next project, the next extraction, the next paradise to exploit. Because that's how the system works. That's what it's designed to do. Extract value, maximize profit, move on before the consequences catch up. Miami is collapsing, and the really terrifying truth is that it's working exactly as intended. The people who built this disaster already made their money. They don't care what happens next. They never did. If you felt this betrayal watching your own city change beyond recognition, if you've experienced the helplessness of being priced out of your own neighborhood, if you've wondered why the people in charge seem to prioritize profit over everything else, then you understand Miami's story. You're living it too. We all are, to different degrees in different ways. And until we collectively decide that enough is enough, that human beings matter more than property values, that communities are worth preserving even when it's not profitable, nothing will change. Miami will keep collapsing. The next city will start sinking. And we'll keep pretending that paradise is still for sale, right up until the moment the water closes over our heads and we finally understand what we've lost. Remember what it used to mean, that word paradise. Remember what it could mean again if we're brave enough to build it differently this time. And if this story opens your eyes to what's really happening, not just in Miami, but everywhere, then share it with someone who needs to understand. Subscribe for the next investigation, because there are more stories like this, more cities on the brink, more truths that powerful people don't want you to know. The collapse isn't over, it's just beginning. And the only question that matters now is whether we'll keep pretending everything is fine, or whether we'll finally face reality and fight for something better before it's too late.